And the agenda for today is I'll give a brief overview again. Apologies for those that have attended the webinars before of what the standard consultation is for the benefit of those that perhaps haven't participated in these. And then also a brief overview of our approach to relevance within the Leafmark standard. I'll then cover in detail what changes we've made within version 16 to try and enhance relevance. And then the last 30 minutes or so, we've got plenty of time. There'll be opportunity for some questions. And we will also use that as an opportunity to get some feedback from you on the changes that we've made. So firstly, the Leafmark standard consultation. So this is our opportunity when we're writing the standard to get feedback from all of our stakeholders. And the intention is we want to make sure that our intended impacts as we've been developing the standard, that we've achieved them, and that the requirements that we're suggesting are relevant, they're achievable, that they're auditable, and that you think that we're going in the right direction towards our intended impacts. So the consultation is an opportunity for stakeholders to give feedback on the draft standard. So we've published this on the public consultation webpage, and I would really encourage you to have a look through that. But also we have produced summaries. So there's a detailed summary which explains what changes we've made as a result of the development projects that we've had going on for the last couple of years. We've also got a very brief summary. So if you just wanted to know how you would be impacted by this, you can have a look through that and it would summarize those changes very briefly in a concise way. Then what we would like from that is ideally participation in our survey. So this is the simplest way for you to provide feedback. Again, we have a more detailed survey for those with more time, and we have a condensed survey for those that just want to, have limited time. And it's based on the summary. So if you've read the summary, you'll be well equipped to feedback on the survey if you didn't want to read the whole of the draft standard. So the survey is available online, and we also do have translated versions. These are all available on the public consultation webpage. And even if you're not available to complete that survey, we would be really happy if you could distribute that amongst any other relevant stakeholders or colleagues and just spread the word. The consultation does end next week on Monday. So a final push for us on getting that consultation out there. And we really, really do want to hear from as many people as we possibly can. If you didn't want to complete the survey, that's absolutely fine. We, as I mentioned, have a feedback session at the end of today. You can pass your comments through that way, but you can also just email myself or Jenna. Our information is available on the public consultation webpage. You can also phone us, and you could also write us a letter. We're hoping to break down any barriers that there could be in terms of forms of communication. So we will just welcome us to get in contact with us if you're not sure. As I mentioned, that's closing next week on the 17th. We will be sending a synopsis of the feedback that we received from the public consultation and the action that we take following that to everyone that's engaged in the consultation at some point. So, for example, everyone here, we've collected your emails, usual data protection, but rules alive, but what we will use that for is to send you a copy of the public consultation synopsis, so you can be aware of what changes we've made and what feedback we received also. And the recording of this webinar will also be available on the website afterwards if there was anyone else you thought it would be relevant to share with. So that's my usual pitch on the standard consultation. Now moving on to the topic of today's webinar, which is the standard relevance. So Leafmark is slightly different from a lot of other assurance systems in that we only have one standard. So instead of having standards for dairy or arable, we have a single standard. And the reason for this is because of the underpinning of integrated farm management principles. So integrated farm management is that framework to identify and implement more sustainable farming practices. And those principles within that framework are universally relevant. They're relevant in all contexts and to all enterprises and all farming businesses. Yes, the practices within that would be very different, but the thought process behind it and the general principle and outcome that we're trying to achieve is similar to that framework. And I think this is an interesting element of Leafmark, is that its fundamental basis on integrated farm management is one of our greatest strengths. It means that we're communicating a framework and a mindset, and less so a moving towards a tick box exercise. That's really not what we want the standard to be. It's a framework to approach more sustainable farming. But whilst that is greatest strength, integrated farm management is also one of the greatest challenges when writing a standard, because whilst the principles are universally relevant, our job at Leafmark is to make sure that the way we're writing that standard communicates those principles in a way that is relevant to all types of businesses in all countries. And that is a challenge, and we recognise that is a challenge. So there are two ways that we approach relevance within the Leafmark standard to all aspects that could be complex. So countries, industry, whatever we're thinking about in terms of relevance. And that's firstly the language that we're using. Is it clear? Is it as simple as possible? Is it relevant and understandable to all industries? And then secondly are the requirements that we're setting. Are they appropriate to all businesses of all economic resource, of all environmental context? And to ensure that we do think about these two things thoroughly and sufficiently, we've written into our standard setting procedure some measures that mean as we're developing the standard, it makes sure we're checking relevance at various points along that process. So firstly, one of our commitments in the standard setting procedure is that we use language that is clear, specific, objective, and verifiable. Those in itself are, challenges. And that's why when we develop control points, we spend a lot of time discussing the language, and there's a huge amount of thought that goes into each word that's put into a new requirement. But we also make sure that we speak to a range of stakeholders from a variety of different contexts, and we'll also often do trialing of control points to make sure that we may understand what we mean by the language that we've used, but we need to check, and we do check, if that is also understood widely by a range of our stakeholders. Second thing when we're developing the standard is we will do a review of the standard to check and sense check if there are any control points that may not be relevant to particular sectors, and just to read it afresh with a fresh mindset of, is this internationally relevant? Is this relevant to all businesses? And really challenge ourselves to identify where there are things that could be changed. And then finally, the consultation. This is a really important part of the relevance piece for us, because it is the opportunity for us to hear from stakeholders of a variety of different contexts. So we try our best to make sure that we're considering all of our stakeholders and we're including them in the standard development process. But it's so valuable to hear from somebody to say, okay, but in my context, this may not be relevant because. And if we've not already come up with a solution to that, we can factor that into our decision making. And in the long run, it's also incredibly beneficial because it means in the future, we're already aware of a specific context that we need to address that may be challenging. So we're always trying to enter this into an open mind, to challenge ourselves and to improve the standard every time it's revised. But for version 16, we had 4 specific focuses that we thought we could increase the standard in and improve relevance. And that was on producer groups, protected cropping, so horticultural grasshouses, things like that, livestock, and our international focus. So these 4 projects won't finish with version 16. They're something we'll always be working on, but we did have specific changes that I'm just going to run through now this morning. So the first of which was producer groups. For those that aren't familiar, this is mostly international businesses in the option 2 global gap. But we reviewed the standard to make sure that all of the requirements were clear, regardless of whether they were an option 1 global gap or option 2 global gap. And the one control point that we identified that could be improved, and that was both in the requirement and the language, was the completion of the Leaf Sustainable Farming Review. And what we've done for this control point is clarify that the operator of the quality management system can complete the Leaf Sustainable Farming Review on behalf of all members in that producer group. So if you have option 2 global gap, there only needs to be one leaf sustainable farming review, and that should be completed by the operator of the quality management system. Within the Leaf Sustainable Farming Review, we are working on producing guidance to clarify exactly how that takes place. But as a general principle, practice-based questions can be answered on what practices are implemented within that quality management system, so it is reflective of all businesses. Whereas more data-based questions, that can be taken on a case-by-case basis of the information that is available within that business and within that format. So that's the only change that we had on producer groups. I will also leave time for questions at the end if we don't get around to them at this point. The next then was protected cropping, so horticulture, glasshouses. We are also putting in our glossary a definition of protected cropping and a lot of various terms that we have included if they are new. So with protected cropping, we took the same approach where we reviewed the standard to see both if the language was correct and if the requirements were relevant. And we found that there were two main aspects that we could improve. The first was moving away from an emphasis on soil-based requirements. And the second is that we did find that we had a tendency to use some slightly more arable biased language. So to improve the elements of soil and recognising growth in substrate, we've included within the soil management plan additional information for how to structure that plan if you grow in substrate. The reason that we're not changing the name from a soil management plan to a substrate management plan is that we would still like to encourage that even on sites that grow in substrate, that there is still that consideration of soil that is on the site. Yes, not from a growing perspective, but from a general soil health perspective, it is still relevant. And in terms of pushing towards best practice, that's still an important thing to consider. So we have referenced more clarity that soil management plan can be focused to include substrate and where possible additional information of any soil on that site. And what we have also done is in the introduction section, we've added more detail on what are the requirements for management plans. And as a brief summary, a management plan can be called anything that you want it to be called. What the auditor is checking is that those bullet points within the management plan control points are met. So if you want to, say, combine your soil management plan and your water management plan, that's absolutely fine. You can call it however you want to, or you could utilize existing documents. You just need to check that the bullet points within those relevant control points are met, and that you'd be able to describe and show that to your auditor when they visited the site. So that's the soil focus. And then the second focus was moving away from the phrase field boundaries, just because that wasn't really relevant to sites that were purely protected cropping. So that's why we've introduced the phrase and or site boundaries to really clarify why that's relevant to those businesses. And that's used in control point 8.7 and 8.14. So now moving on to the next change, which was livestock focus. So in version 15, we'd actually changed this section significantly to enhance the relevance to livestock systems. But some feedback that we'd had after publication of the Leafmark standard version 15 was that that was slightly grazing focused, apologies. And that what we needed to do is think perhaps more specifically from the perspective of pigs and poultry, and more generally about grass in the role in terms of livestock systems. So that's what we did for version 16. And again, we just went through the whole standard, thinking from a very, purely livestock and pigs and poultry emphasis basis to identify what could be improved. Again, it was both language and specific requirements that we felt. Mostly, one of the changes that we included was not applicable for application of manures in two control points. That was 2.11 and 3.2. In terms of requirement-based change, that was in 5.13, where we've added reference to minimising waste of feed and or nutrients. And then the other thing that we really wanted to emphasize was the importance and relevance of managing grass as a crop. So we would sometimes be queried, well, why is the crop health and protection section relevant to me if I'm a purely livestock business? And again, it's that emphasis on really thinking about grass and management and incorporating that into management decisions, even if you are a livestock business. So that's the emphasis and the changes that we made for the livestock section. And then the final emphasis was then on international relevance. So this is a wider conversation for us where we're improving international relevance, our long-term approach, not only through the standard, but through our whole mindset of how do we engage with international businesses, what are the enablers for us really encouraging the growth of and supporting the growth of Leafmark in these businesses. So we're not just looking at it from a standard perspective, it goes beyond that. But for today, from a standard perspective, the changes that we've made were mostly language-based. The one phrase that we used quite a lot within the standard was environmentally sensitive areas and statutory landscape designations. So they're probably widely understood, but we felt the phrase that we've included in terms of protected and or high conservation value areas, these were in some internationally recognised dictionaries and sources that are used. We felt that was more relevant to be used. So that's been amended in 8.29. And also just to note that 8.29 isn't a new control point entirely. That used to be in section, the livestock section, 5.6. We felt that it was putting it slightly into a pigeonhole by having it in 5.6, and we felt it was more relevant internationally and from a wider approach if we have that in 8.29. I would also reference from the international perspective that we have a new control point in terms of the deforestation control point. So we deleted the previous control point that focused on land use change and really strengthened the requirements. I believe it's 8.28 off the top of my head. So it is well worth having a look at that, but we refer to some international treaties and global objectives in terms of timelines, and that could affect some of our international businesses, I expect, more potentially than our UK-based businesses. So do have a look at that if that's relevant to your group. So that is a very brief summary of the changes that we've made for international relevance.